A question that's asked commonly enough in gaming is whether or not games need to be fun in order to be good. The question itself is worth a few forum threads of banter, and it's really not so relevant right now. What is relevant, though, is one perspective on the question, namely that of Jaeger, the developers of Spec Ops: The Line. They created a war shooter revolving around characters who don't like doing what they do, caught in a situation where everything goes from bad to worse. Clearly enough, they were interested in making a serious game. But with their opportunity to create a truly exhaustive experience, they made the mistake of implementing their dark, twisted plot and characters into a serious game for idiots. The story that unfolds isn't anything amazing, but it's coherent and pretty solid. It concerns Nolan North and his Delta Force subordinates on an evacuation mission in post-apocalyptic Dubai that goes terribly wrong. Because resources are scarce and most of the city's population has died, the survivors of a devastating sandstorm and the military that stayed with them to assess their situation have all begun an awful lot of infighting, and Delta Force is sucked into the struggle just about as soon as it arrives. From its inception, the soldiers' journey worsens as they're confronted by lots and lots of angry, desperate people and forced to make choices in moral gray areas. The writing and character arcs are handled pretty well. At first, the cast of characters seems like something you'll have successfully tuned out within the first hour, fueled by a bunch of military story cliches and one-liners.
Let me go on record and say this shit just got weird.
But everybody actually grows and the writing quality rises as the situation worsens. People start doubting each other's motives, responding to the protagonist's actions, and overall getting really angry. The character performances are pretty great too, even enough to make Nolan North actually emote. There are a few flaws in the subplots and pacing, but the actions of individual characters are really the story's best front. But even though the story is pretty nice, it loses a lot at the fault of Spec Ops: The Line's storytelling. Everything that's supposed to be mature and interesting almost unfailingly shows itself only in cutscenes and walking segments, which is a pretty massive flaw when taking into account that it is a computer game. And this is an especial problem when the gameplay itself is so divergent from the themes that the story wants to convey. And this especial problem is accentuated by the fact that the gameplay fucking sucks. The Line is a modern third-person cover shooter, a checklist of the same conventions that have been infesting the third-person shooter for years now. Honestly, it plays just like Gears of War, Uncharted, Kane & Lynch 2, and numerous other mindless target practice games out there. It's flawed on a fundamental level because there's just so little intricacy to the gunplay. Using cover is a natural element in any shooter, but the focus of a good gunplay model's challenge is, shockingly, shooting people, as opposed to avoiding as much damage as possible. When a shooter centralizes around sticking to cover, it places specific safe spots and discourages any deviation from them. The majority of the combat consists of sticking to a wall or alternating between a few walls, popping up to fire on other people who stick behind walls, taking some damage, and then sitting back down again to wait for that damage to vanish. Because the game is third person, there's no loss of spatial awareness when hiding behind cover. Because health regenerates extremely fast, there's no incentive to leave that cover and make a risky move. Because the environments are so restrictively linear, there's no opportunity to decide where to go. There's no need for either side to flank except in deliberately scripted events. All of these omissions culminate in an extremely lazy design philosophy that promotes, oftentimes even enforces, a lazy playstyle and trivializes a fuck ton of elements that make fighting interesting in games. And those were just criticisms of similar cover shooters as a whole. Needless to say, they apply to The Line, or else I wouldn't be mentioning them, but the game has its own little problems. Perhaps most important are the imprecise and simplistic controls. The commands for sprint, toggle cover, and context action are all mapped to the same key. Sprinting is hard to control and even jerky at times, so it's entirely possible to run into everybody's line of sight on accident past the wall you were right next to that you wanted to use as cover. Also, the squad tactic, that's a singular tactic, that the game touts is nothing but a button press that tells your two squad mates to shoot somebody. But Spec Ops: The Line is supposed to be telling a story about desperation in the aftermath of a disaster. You're in a desert shithole 6 months after it's been destroyed by sand, caught up in a fight over water and power, but the gameplay has absolutely nothing to show for that. The most that the narrative and gameplay intertwine is that the narrative contextualizes all the shootouts that happen. The gunfights are otherwise completely distant because they just don't touch the reality of the situation. If everybody is actually so desperate to survive, then the regenerating health, the ample supply of fully functioning weaponry and ammunition, the number of combatants, and the AI of combatants sure do a terrible job of emphasizing that feeling. Most cover shooters use a whole lot of gaudy set pieces to draw attention away from the normally terrible shooting, and the line is no different. Some events like sandstorms aren't all that conventional, but they have minimal effect on the actual gameplay apart from reduced visibility and accuracy, and they're still coupled with all of the massive explosions, collapsing buildings, and so on that the game crams down your throat. It's only after a firefight when a cutscene plays that any actual drama occurs. And apart from the dialogue and the camera angles, the drama is no better than any of the action. Because the game is already so numbingly in your face with violence and other set pieces, the only way it can still grab your attention is by exploiting the fuck out of its serious subject matter. Just about every 10 or 15 minutes, the gunfights punctuate themselves with rows, piles, and painfully intentional tableaux of dead bodies. Sometimes it's to make the enemy seem like a bunch of terrible people. Sometimes it's to make you feel guilty for following the game's irrational, unalterable script, but invariably, it's just an obvious attempt to manipulate your emotions in a very simplistic manner. Expanding from the immodestly exploitative cutscenes are the immodestly exploitative moral choice sections that pepper the narrative, which are Spec Ops: The Line's way of saying that everything is a big moral gray area in war. To its credit, the moral choices are very ambiguous, but they aren't impactful. They have the choice, but they're missing both the setup and the outcome. The game presents these scenarios with a very spur-of-the-moment attitude, which could be considered a good thing if they were at all jarring, but they're really not. The scenario simply tells you the two options you have and leaves you to your devices without any past information that could incentivize one option or the other, depending on how attached you might be to a certain facet of the story. One option is typically more brutal, but that's about it. The choices are preceded more by regular old action than actual storytelling too, which really adds to how artificial they feel. As an example, at one point you encounter a minor character who is dying slowly and painfully, and you have the option to kill him with your gun instead. But because he only appears in a small part of the story to help continue the narrative, there's no real reason to choose one option over the other. Even better, he is going to die either way. And because he has no real character whatsoever, his death matters as much as all the deaths that occurred in the mindless, piss-easy, on-rails infinite ammo grenade launcher segment that met its conclusion a matter of seconds before the scene in question. And the choices don't actually influence the narrative beyond a few immediate bits of dialogue, and which images get referenced in the ending cutscene. The choices you have to make exist in a vacuum and are there solely to get a cheap reaction, the same way that an action horror game would evoke screams from the weak through a monster closet. Everything that actually matters to the narrative takes place out of player control between boring cover shooting segment after boring cover shooting segment. Even though the campaign of Spec Ops: The Line is peppered with austerity and its firefights contextualized, the game is still this perfectly gaming industry standard safe. It plays no differently from all the other stupid cover shooters that have come before it, and it makes its claim to fame through cinematic direction that isn't poor and a bucket full of offensive imagery orchestrated to make you feel bad. It's nothing but a shooter clone that wants to appear as though it's going in a different new direction with a more thoughtful and serious tone. But this different new direction towards somber, twisted games is paved elsewhere.
It's better than regular sex.